This is the Extra Point Podcast. During this podcast, we will dive deeper into our Sunday teaching and share practical next steps for your faith journey. Now, let's kick off the Extra Point.
Hey, welcome to the Extra Point. I'm Cheryl Ross, the Next Steps in Discipleship pastor here at Southridge Church, and I'm with Scott Beha, our lead pastor. But before we get into anything further, I want to make sure that if you haven't liked or subscribed to this podcast, you go ahead and do so. That way you don't miss out on any new content, and make sure to share this with someone, as the things that we are going to be talking about over the next few weeks could help answer a lot of questions that people might have about the Bible or God and faith. So this past Sunday, we dove into one part of the question, why do we follow some of the Old Testament laws but not all of them? And to really get to that question, you knew we had to kind of go back to the basics about our understanding about the Bible and what the purpose of the Bible and those laws were in the first place. And you shared, Pastor Scott, about how, like, for many of us, at some point we were just given a Bible and told to read it. And what we don't always know is that the Bible is not like other books.
Not at all.
That starting from the beginning and reading just from the beginning to the end is not necessarily the best way, especially for new believers or young believers. And when you don't fully understand what the purpose is or what the story is. So share with us a little bit about why that is so important to understand.
Yeah, in some ways, the Bible's a book that's best read backwards. So if you will start in the New Testament and get really certain about who Jesus is, why he came, what he did, what he was about, and then if you went and read the first part of it, then it would make sense. I've shared this before, I think, in one of our devotionals, but the way the Old Testament and the New Testament should operate is a lot like many of us were, unless you're like just a straight up book nerd, which I'm not, in regards to like classical literature and stuff. It's the way that a lot of us were actually introduced to the Lord of the Rings, right? The Lord of the Rings all came out. We all watched those, and we were like, oh, wow, that's awesome. And for me, who wasn't like a Tolkien fan before that and didn't know much about the other literature, when The Hobbit came out, I was like, holy cow, there's a whole story that talks about how the ring came about and all of this. It was the whole back. And so that's kind of how we were introduced to the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That's kind of how you should read the Bible. If you start with the New Testament, get really certain of what's going on there and get real grounded in Jesus, then when you go back and you see the backstory, don't see them as two separate things, but see them as one continuous story, then everything begins to make sense. And then you can begin to read from front to back instead of reading back to front. And I don't mean back to front, meaning starting in Revelation. That would be a drastically bad idea. I mean starting with like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and read those until you can't read them anymore, and then get real certain about Acts, and then you may go back and get into stuff like the Psalms and Proverbs and wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Even though if you don't understand the overarching purpose of the story from Genesis to Revelation, a lot of the Psalms you might misinterpret.
Yes.
Because a lot of the Psalms actually serve the storyline that's going on. Yes. They were the songs of the people, and they were singing about how God was working in creation. So these aren't just like worship songs that like, where we're just, they weren't just writing them simply to praise God. Right. They were helping move the story along, and some of them almost prophetically as well. And so the Psalms, as much as people go to them to find peace and reassurance and things, were also part of how God wrote down this story through his people to make it continuous. And so, it's a disservice to people to give them a Bible and go read it and follow it. And you go, well, which parts? Because there's some stuff in there that I will admittedly say you should not follow.
Yes. My daughter, who's 8, found this out like this past summer. Just a couple months ago, she had been reading, she started in Genesis, and she was all about reading her Bible there for a little while. And it was really cool. However, there was one day she said, Mom, I have a question. She's in my bed laying next to me. She'd been reading her Bible, and she just starts reading about the story of Lot and his daughters and how it's Lot, right? They got him drunk.
Oh, Noah.
Noah. Yes.
Well, and it was his sons.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no. The ones who they got him drunk and went in and slept with him. It's Lot, right?
It might have been.
I think so.
It happens. So,
anyway,
listen,
there's
that plot
crazy
line
stuff.
of different, because like you get the story of Tamar and Judah not far into Genesis as well.
But I think it's after they come out of Sodom, and it's just like him and the daughters, and they say, if we don't do this, it will be.
Okay, I got you. Yeah,
will be. We won't have anybody to be passed on or whatever. And so, anyway, she just starts reading the story about how this happens, and they go in and they sleep with their dad, and then they become pregnant, and she's like, "What is this talking about?" Yep. And then she's like, "And why were Adam and Eve naked?" And they were just running around naked. And I'm like, she's like, "It's so weird." And I'm like, yeah. And I had to explain that not everything in the Bible is good or what we should do. It's telling a story.
Yeah.
And so I kind of, steered her to go and start in John instead. And she was upset because she was like, "No, I want to start in the beginning." And I'm like, I understand, but you need to do this a little differently. And it's things like that. I think that.
Yes. So that's Genesis 19.
Yes.
My whole mind right now, just to let everyone know, I am fully immersed in Genesis 1 through 11 personally right now. And so that's why I went straight to Noah when you said that.
Right.
That's all.
But that's also a very weird story.
That's a crazy story.
Yes.
But we're going to do a series on Genesis 1 through 11 again, which I did a couple of years ago, but I didn't fully understand it. And the reason why I think that almost every sermon that you're going to hear me preach, we go back to Genesis because, and again, I'm not saying that you should start your Bible study there if you're not seasoned in the New Testament. But everything, any story, you go to the beginning chapters to figure out the foundation of where it's headed. If you don't get the storyline from Genesis 1 through 11, then you're going to miss what's happening, which is what has happened. So let me give you a brief summary of what has happened in the last 200 years to where if what was taught Sunday was the first time you've ever heard some of this stuff and you go, I see it, I agree with it, but why has no one ever told me this before? Here's what happened is when you take Genesis 1 through 11 and start to do things it was never meant to do with it and insist that it's a certain type of literature that it's actually not, then you distort the whole rest of the story of the Bible. Right. And so what happened was during the Enlightenment period, the 1800s or so and beyond, so for over 200 years now, we went through a process where, there's this big scientific boom, Age of Enlightenment, all of this stuff. And then you get kind of the postmodernism where I don't know that we can trust anything. And then the church's response to what was happening in the scientific community, in the philosophical community, the church's response was fundamentalism, which was, no, we're going to double down on the Bible, which I think you should, but you should double down in the right way. We're going to double down on the Bible, and we're going to insist that everything in here is to be interpreted completely literally and not so much in the way that it had historically been read. So here's the problem, is the response to the Enlightenment was fundamentalism, and so they went back to Genesis 1, the story of creation. And they started to go, well, this is about how God created the whole cosmos in 6 literal days. And if you don't believe that, then you can't be a Christian. And that's not actually the point that Genesis 1 is making. And then they do the same thing in Genesis 2. You get to Genesis 3, they make the whole story about how humanity has fallen. And then they just tell the rest of this story as if, and then you get to the flood, and they think for the flood, it's like, no, it had to be this specific type of flood, and so they are reading Genesis 1 through 11 more like it's a scientific textbook rather than thinking about what was going on in the ancient Near East when these stories were created, which is these stories came out of the ancient Near Eastern culture. These are not the only stories that existed in that time period. In fact, there's a lot of stories that if you knew what you were actually looking for, if you were really immersed in the ancient Near Eastern text, you would see that Genesis 1 through 11 was not written as a modern textbook, but it was actually written to combat the other myths that were being told in the ancient world. So like all the other surrounding nations had their own creation stories. They actually, a bunch of them had their own flood stories,
Right.
which probably speaks to the validity that something probably happened. And Genesis 1 through 11 was God revealing to Moses how all of it actually happened. And it's like this rebuttal to the other ancient Near Eastern stories. And so if you read them like a scientific textbook, then you're off to a really bad start. If you read them like you would any other ancient Near Eastern, and I'm going to say this word, it's going to cause some consternation for people. I don't mean that it's untrue, but myth. If you read it like an ancient Near Eastern myth, rather than, and again, that doesn't mean that 1 through 11 is not true. It is true, but if you read it through that lens, then you'll actually get the proper story that's being told. And so what happens is if you turn 1 through 11 into a textbook and you go, it has to be 6 literal days, it has to be a literal this, and then all of a sudden you're missing the actual story that's being told. If you read it the way that it was written, like again, these are documents that came out of a very specific time period with specific genre, and that genre had specific rules. If you read it in light of that, and what has happened actually over the last like 20 years, the amount of information that we have learned about the ancient Near East is changing this whole conversation.
Right.
So like, I promise you what scholarship is going to do over the next 20 to 50 years is the fundamentalists are going to fall so far out of favor because the overwhelming evidence of archaeology and everything that's coming about is going to undermine everything that they have been teaching. Which again, and I talked about this on a podcast that we're doing for the West Virginia Ministries a couple weeks ago. This is like for preachers, and I know not everyone that listens to this is preachers, and this may just be for the two of us. If you are using commentaries that are more than 20 years old, that's fine. But if you don't have at least some that represent this new scholarship, you're going to be out of date in your teaching.
Yeah.
Because it's literally been new findings. Like they have these new cuneiform tablets that they have found that have informed us even more about what was going on in the ancient Near East. And that happened within the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so all of that is speaking into what's happening in Genesis 1 through 11. So if you read 1 through 11 the wrong way, you will read the rest of the story in the wrong way. Now, I know for some people that go, I'm saved by faith in Jesus. I believe in Jesus and all that. Okay, yeah, we can say that's fine. I think that if you just take that, yes, Jesus forgives you of your sin and whatnot. But I promise you, if you want to live a life that is full and meaningful and where you understand the riches and the depths, like if we believe God wrote a book, and I don't mean that he like passed it down from heaven, I mean that he inspired certain people through their cultures and through their own words to write certain things down to preserve them for us the way we would find out about him. If you believe that God did that, this book is worth mining for absolutely everything you can find in it, and not just going, well, it's too much for me to figure out, so I'm just gonna I'm saved, I'm good, I'm just gonna stick with the simple story. That's fine. If that's you, you're gonna make it. You're my brother, you're my sister, you're gonna be in the new heavens, the new earth with us. But a lot of what is to come will probably be shocking to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's so foundational. Like for me, I understood the Lord of the Rings better after I saw The Hobbit.
Right.
And so if you start with the New Testament, And then you understand the Old Testament. When you go back to the New Testament, you'll start to see stuff that you didn't see the first time through. And then the whole thing begins to get so much more beautiful. And to me, even more compelling, as someone that has always wrestled with doubts throughout my whole life, the more that I see how interwoven this book is and how it actually fits into the overarching history of the world, the more convinced. And I know the fundamentalists would go, oh, no. If you start undermining Genesis 1 through 11 as not being supposed to be taken as completely literal in every possible sense, then you're going to be off course. No. My faith is actually being built by understanding what Genesis 1 through 11 is actually about.
Yeah.
In a way that, like, no one's going to be able to take it from me now, because this story makes so much more sense now.
Yeah.
It becomes obvious when you begin to see the threads that this was written by over 40 different people over a course of about 1,500 years, not to mention the amount of, like, people that got involved in the editing process throughout the scribes and how they were, because it was an oral tradition that was passed down. Eventually they wrote documents, and then they didn't all reach their final form until probably post-exile. It doesn't mean that God didn't ordain that whole process.
Right.
And the more that you realize that this was like over all these, and yet there is one single story being told from all these authors.
Yeah.
That's something only God could do.
Yeah.
And so the better I understand Genesis to Revelation, the more my faith in Jesus has actually been increased. Because I now realize only God could write a book like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, only God could. If I sat down, I could write a book like this if I sat down and wrote it all in my lifetime. But it was only me. But if you took me and someone in another country and another country and another country across 1,500 years and told us to write a story together, we would never be able to come up with something like this.
Right.
And that's what makes all of this so much more beautiful the deeper that we dive. And that was a really long introduction to the Extra Point podcast.
That's okay. I think we did tell people on Sunday that it would be a lot of a deeper dive. So
we are diving so deep.
So how, like, you did take us back to Genesis 1, 26 and 28. How does everything really point back to that? And how is that initial purpose played out in everything that we see to come?
Okay. And I don't know if this is, like, obvious to people, or maybe because it wasn't obvious to me, but again, I don't know that anyone ever taught me this. Not because they had bad motives. I just, again, I think most of us were raised up in a more fundamentalist background where they weren't focused on this sort of stuff whatsoever. And so they would get so focused on sin that it would feel like, well, that must be the point of it, is that you're just not supposed to do certain things. You're supposed to do certain things, and God just gets to choose what those are, which he does. But it's more beautiful than that. That's what bothers me so much about simplistic readings of the scriptures, is like, when we think about God as a rule giver or as a lawgiver, sometimes people have a negative connotation of that. But look at the very first things that God ever told humanity to do. They were not curses. They were not burdens. They were blessings. Like he says, let's make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign, underline reign, over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals that scurry along the ground. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. That's not just a good idea. That's a command. The first command he gives to humanity, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth, that's another command, and govern it. That's why when people look at me like I'm crazy when I say, listen, we were built, like we were made by God to rule over creation, and that's what we will do for all time. That's why I'm so like, don't talk about going to heaven when you die as your final destination, because you were made to rule over the created order. It's right here. When the first time humanity is talked about, humanity's purpose is given. You can't have Like, so the New Testament talks about sin, and they use the word hamartia, which is like an archery term that means to miss the mark. And for a lot of people, we go, well, what do you mean miss the mark? What mark are we shooting for? Are we just shooting for, well, God said that this is bad, so don't do that. If you are aiming, that's not the mark. The mark that's being missed when we talk about sin is Genesis 1:26-28. It is, you were created to reign and rule over the created order under the governance of God. You were meant to be his partners in this under him. And every sin is actually a violation of that. It is, I wanted to do my own thing. I didn't want to live under God. I didn't want to image God to the rest of the world. I wanted to be God. I didn't want to show people what the one true God was actually like. Now, there's not a single sin, most likely, that we have ever talked about that gets overturned when you start to think of it like that. So murder's still going to be bad, but it's not going to be arbitrary. It's not just going to be, well, God decided that killing people's bad, so no, it's going to be because it's a failure to be who you were created to be, why you can't do that. And again, that's what we're going to get into this Sunday, is the specifics of how do these laws end up playing out in a modern context. And so, like, when you look at all of this language, you see it's the first things God ever told humanity to do were all blessings. Be fruitful and multiply. That right there informs so many modern debates that we have in the church about, and again, we'll get into this Sunday, about marriage, about sexuality, about sexual encounters, and just, it informs so much right here. It's all of Genesis 1:26-28. It's not an obscure passage from Leviticus. It's what was humanity originally created to do: be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
And reign over the created order. And when we decided that we didn't want to do it in God's way, we forfeited that. And so the failure or the sin, the transgression, was not being what we were made to be. Not that we just started breaking laws, right? Because we didn't even know that there was any laws until the laws showed up.
Yeah.
The original human failure that you see in Genesis 3 is the snake comes up, which we're going to talk about the snake whenever we get to Satan later on in this series.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is the snake is a cosmic being that turned its back on God. Because, and the reason why is that God had, for some reason, decided that he was going to partner with humanity to reign over the created order. There was a rebellion in heaven that took place that said, we do not want the humans to be the ones to help reign over the created order. And so this little weasel comes down in the form of a snake and gets the woman and the man to eat the fruit to destroy their destiny as God's rulers over creation. That's what he like, because there's a sense in which you go, oh, they just ate a fruit. How ridiculous is this God that he wrecks the whole world because he ate a fruit? No, it's not that they ate the fruit. It's that they were deceived by the serpent to say, we don't want God to choose what is good and bad for us. We want to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, so the way we get to decide what is good and bad. It's the same thing. The serpent wanted to be God. We find out later that the serpent is who we would come to call Satan, but that's not, we'll learn this later in the series. That's not actually a name. That's a title. For him, and it was all about destroying God's plan to partner with humanity to oversee all of creation. And so again, when you get there, now all of this begins to make more sense as you go, so what was the original problem? Was it that you ate from the wrong tree? Because that certainly makes God look petty. No, it was that humanity goes, we don't want to do it the way that you want us to do it. And so now every failure from that point on is a failure of us to be who we were created to be. And so now all of a sudden, the oughtness that we feel within us, like the things that we ought to do, the things that we ought not to do, are now grounded in, like, this is what it was created to do. Like, you wouldn't say something that's not created to do that is failing because it didn't do it.
Right.
You would say it's failing because it's not doing what it was created to do. If you can ground everything in that, then all of a sudden, like, just think of the modern arguments that we have caused, and this will be a lot of what we talk about Sunday, but like when we get to a topic like homosexuality, which has been a hot topic in the church, right? And I'll be frank, I don't think the church has handled it well.
No.
And again, because we have moralized everything and just gone, no, we have a law for that. We have a law for that.
Right.
And what I want to teach Sunday is, yes, we have some laws for that, and they're echoed in the New Testament, sure. There's a more beautiful answer, is that in the foundations of how humanity was made was marriage between man and woman. Why? Is that because God's against everything else and wants no. Listen, the reason why is because the original human mandate was to fill the earth, multiply. You can't do that in same-sex relationships.
Right.
So therefore, a same-sex relationship would therefore undermine the original human vocation, which is why it has been outlawed by God.
Yeah.
It's not arbitrarily picking on a community going, no, sorry, you can't be who. No. It's not, well, I've got a Leviticus 18 here for you. No, it's not that. It's a failure of the original design. And so, and again, I know that answer, that brings a lot of questions. What about people that are infertile and da. Yes, I get it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a perfect system,
Right.
because of what
The
we talked about week one.
yeah.
The original fall broke everything to where there are going to be people that have physical ailments but that doesn't mean that it opens up other relationship options that would not fulfill. It means the way that the world is going to be filled will be through the means by which God has destined it to be done, whether or not every single person gets to participate in that or not, because God has called some people, because it's not just the infertile situation where some people can't have kids, which is a travesty if they want that, and I know that's a real pain for people.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're not fulfilling God's purpose for their life, because God also calls certain people to be single, which means that they're not going to help populate the earth either, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a role in it, that they can't also still image God and reign and rule. It just means that when it comes to the sexual relations, they were grounded in something. It wasn't just, nobody's just arbitrarily picking on a community of people. And again, when I said I'm going to write a book called It Was Our Fault, it's because when we talk to people about topics like this, we go and we pull a passage out of Leviticus to hit them with.
Yeah.
And then 2 pages later, it says that you're not supposed to eat shellfish.
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to wear polyester. And they go, well, wait a second. Now it just feels like you're picking on us. It's like, that's why you have to have better answers. Because I can fully say that I love the people of that community, that I don't agree with their choices. Because I didn't pick a random verse to say that their choices were wrong. I have the original human mandate from the very person that created us, and I go, it's just not according to this. I'm not choosing arbitrarily who is in and out. I have something to anchor it in. That's why this Sunday is going to be so important for the way that we interact with people. It's going to have practical, real world, and so we can stop being people that just go, oh, I got a verse for that. I get it. Genesis 1:26-28 is a verse, but like, we're not just pulling random verses that's going to cause more problem. We actually have a firm foundation in the way that God created all of humanity, by which we will come to understand why it is that certain things are outlawed in God's good creation and why certain things are not.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that the Torah was not a complete legal code for every culture and every time period, which kind of just goes a little bit deeper on what we've just been talking about. So share with us what exactly that means and how we need to view the Torah and what the Torah is.
Yeah, so by way of definition, when we talk about Torah, we're just talking about the law. And specifically the Jewish law that you read about in the second part of Exodus, as well as Leviticus. You get some recapitulations of it in Deuteronomy, but that's where it comes from. Essentially, You start with the 10 Commandments, and then they get like 613 more beyond that that are given. And so why should we not say that the Torah is God's ideal society? Because that's not what was going on. God had a very specific purpose for Israel, that they would be his kingdom of priests and represent him to the rest of the world. But he was not going to take them from where they were in their ancient, 4000 BC context and make them live as people do in 2026, because it wouldn't have made any sense.
Right.
And so what he was going to do is he was going to set up some parameters of this is how you're going to be different than the nations around you. And so when you get into the Torah, what has been so mistaken in a lot of ways is why there are certain things that are in there that haven't carried over. Well, what you're seeing is there are ceremonial laws that are in there. There are purity laws that are in there, but those only had to deal with, and again, this is why when you read the book of Exodus and you get halfway through, or so you get to Exodus 19, God gives the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, and he gives a couple laws about fair treatment of slaves and things like that, and then the rest of Exodus turns into how to build a tabernacle. The reason why that was why that happens right after the people are rescued is because, again, if you go back to Genesis, the whole point of the Bible is how God comes to be with his people. The tabernacle will be the original way that God comes to be in the middle of his people. That's why you get these elaborate instructions of how to build it.
Yes.
So that way, before they get to Leviticus, they already have the instructions of how to make a place that God can dwell in their midst. And so when you then go into Leviticus and you start to see some of these odd commands, you go, what the heck is this about? My tent has mold in it, and now I've got to do something about it. Like, how is that a law? Again, you have the manifest presence of God living in the community. So a lot of the sacrificial system, a lot of the purity laws and ceremonial laws had to do with how do we create an environment that a holy God can live in. And it wasn't meant to be moral in the sense of, oh, it's bad to wear, this, or like, oh, you got a skin disease, you're awful. No. It wasn't meant to be moral in that sense. It was meant to answer this question. All right, the manifest presence of God wants to come and live in the midst of us. So anything that might be the antithesis of this life-giving God cannot be part of our community. And so mold, decay, anything that represents death had to go to make the ideal environment for God to dwell in the midst of his people. And so when you read Leviticus through that, you go, oh. And then there would be certain sins that the people could commit that would be so heinous that would taint the community. That those had to be outlawed so severely that sometimes the Bible goes, that should be punishable by death. And again, that's because anything that's the antithesis of God, the life-bringing God, could not coexist in that community. And so we don't go and say, well, that should happen for all time,
right? Because
the Torah wasn't even a complete list of laws.
Yeah.
In fact, if you go and study ancient Near Eastern law codes, like if you've ever heard of Hammurabi's code, which was one of the original law codes that we get, the way that ancient Near Eastern law was written was they were written in a way that they were meant to be guidelines that would be given to the king to help him make wise rulings. So these were like, I'm reading this to gain wisdom. I'm reading the quote unquote law to gain wisdom. That way, when I'm handling a case, I will have the wisdom to say what is right and what is wrong.
Right.
So they weren't writing, like for us in America, we're used to like constitutional laws and stuff where it's like, here's the law, you break it, you go to jail. That's not what they wrote law codes for in the ancient Near East. They wrote them to help the rulers gain wisdom, which is why when you get into different parts of the law, there's weird situations that come up, and it's like, why would you there's a law in the Torah about if a woman who is pregnant gets in the middle of a fight between two guys and the baby gets killed. Who's going to get killed for that baby that got killed? And you go, now, God, why would you answer that question in the Torah and then say nothing about some pretty significant things if this was meant to be your codified law for all time. That's a weird thing that, like, we're worried about this pregnant lady who for some reason is going to be getting in the middle of this fight and the baby's going to get killed, but yet we didn't say anything about, X, Y, or Z modern issue that's going on. That's weird. Yeah. So we know that it wasn't meant to be a law that was going to be in every culture for all time. God was doing something very specific with Israel, setting them apart from the people around them, so the way they would be a light to the nations, and ultimately that Genesis 12 promise of God blessing the whole world would come through that nation. Israel was supposed to make an Eden of all of creation, but we know they continuously failed to be the light bringers that they were called to be.
Yeah. That's good. Now, you got into the fact of how, like, it wasn't an issue of like bad law, but the enslaved people can't free themselves, and how it can inform but not transform. And that's really where we kind of get into how Jesus came and made everything right. So let's get into that and walk us through how Jesus does that.
Yeah, so this is why I've told our church a lot over the last couple of years. I hope it's starting to sink in. If you do not understand the story of the Exodus, again, this is foundational. If you're in Genesis and Exodus and you don't get what's going on there, you're going to miss what's really happening. The Exodus is God's prototype of what it looks like when he sets his people free. And so that gets all that language gets carried into the New Testament and applied to what Jesus is doing for us from the slavery of sin, to free us from the slavery of sin. So if you don't understand the Exodus, what's going on there, you won't really understand what the New Testament is talking about when it talks about salvation, which again is why you get people that will go like, oh, just pray a prayer or whatever, and then you're going to go to heaven someday. And you go, no. What happened to the people in the Exodus? They were released from their captivity. They were free to finally be the people that God created Israel to be. So they didn't have autonomy to just go and do whatever they wanted to do and then say, well, because I prayed a prayer, I'm going to heaven one day. They now had the freedom to become that light to the nations God had always called them to be. So if you miss that in the Exodus story, you'll miss that in the Jesus story as well, because what Jesus is going to come and do is there's a covenant that God had with Israel that is kind of still left open-ended. As you get to the end of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, this covenant is not where it was meant to be. The covenant has been broken, first and foremost, which meant that someone had to pay for that. There had to be, like when you made a covenant with, these are what in the ancient Near Eastern world is called a suzerain treaty. It was between a king and like their vassal or whatnot. When you made that sort of treaty, like whoever broke it was liable for the curse of that covenant. So before a new covenant can come, the old covenant has to come to its full completion, which means someone has to be punished for that, and someone has to fully live it out as well. So someone has to be faithful to it. Someone has to get punished for it. Because without that, then the covenant is not satisfied to where something new can come. So in Jesus, what you're getting is not simply, well, God was mad at us because we broke the world, and so he's just going to take it all out on his son, and then that makes it okay. Which is the way that a lot of us talk about salvation.
Right.
Oh, this chap, Jesus, just got in the way of God's wrath and vengeance, and now I get to go scot-free.
Yeah.
No, I mean, will that save you? Probably. Is that what actually, does that paint God in the proper light? Not in the least bit. Why, like when people go, why did God just not forgive everyone? Why did someone have to die? Well, because he made a covenant with Israel, who was representing all of humanity at this moment, and they broke it. But the beautiful thing about the story of Jesus on the cross is not God sending his son to be tortured because that's not what was going on, because again, Jesus is fully God. He's part of the triune God. He chose to be part of this plan, and that's why I went to Genesis 15. See how everything comes back to Genesis and Exodus, and
Yes.
it really bothers me that more people don't understand.
Right.
Genesis 15 is this covenant where it's called the cleaving of the meats, where Abram separates all these animals and creates a river of blood. You walk through it, the blood splashes up, and he goes, if I break my covenant with you, this is what's going to happen to me. I'm going to be ripped to shreds. But Abram never walked those pieces. God walked for both of them, which meant all the way from Genesis 15 that one day Yahweh, the God of Israel, was going to show up in some sort of human form.
Yeah.
So that way he would be the one that would get ripped to shreds to take the curse of the punishment.
Yeah.
And then the beautiful thing about the story of Jesus is, yes, he gets to get ripped to shreds by the Romans for the curse of the punishment, thus taking care of the curse portion, but he also faithfully lives out the call to be the light to the nations, to be the human that Israel could never be.
Right.
So therefore, then this is what he says in Matthew 5:17. He doesn't abolish the law. Right. He's the only one that ever came and fully accomplished it. Yeah. And so therefore, when it comes to the old covenant that God had with Israel and humanity, it was someone's got to pay. Yes, but God's going to be the one that does it. Yes, he does that. But then it needs to be fulfilled as well. Yes, he does that as well. Because as we talked about, Matthew makes it very clear. You can see this in all the Gospels, but again, this is why some people when you go, oh, what Gospel should I read first? I'd go with Matthew. Mainly because of this. You're going to see that he is meant to be the true Israel of God. Right? That's why Matthew's the only one that mentions that Jesus' family goes into Egypt. That's on purpose.
Yeah.
The other gospel writers knew about that.
Yeah.
That wasn't only a fact that Matt had.
Right.
They knew about that.
Yes.
But he does that because he is writing for a Jewish audience to make sure they understand that Jesus did on their behalf what they never did for themselves.
Right.
So he goes into Egypt. He comes out of Egypt. Just like they did in Egypt, they passed through the Red Sea. The next thing you get, Matthew 3, he goes and gets baptized. Then the Father speaks from heaven in that moment. This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. All throughout the Old Testament, Israel is referred to as God's Son, as his firstborn, the whole nation. And now Jesus is embodying that. This is my Son. Some people look at that and go, oh, that was God saying that Jesus is God. No, that's God saying, truthfully, the New Testament makes it obvious that Jesus is God, but that's never actually the point. So a lot of times we look at the miracles and they go, oh, that's how they knew that he, no, that's not what the miracles were doing. The New Testament is not about how Jesus is God. That was already part and parcel if you understood the Old Testament, that one day Yahweh was going to show up.
Yeah.
They already knew that, so they didn't need to prove that he was God. That was already baked into the story. The reason why this stuff was happening was the way it would be obvious that he was the Israel of God, which is why he goes out into the wilderness. So Israel spends 2 months getting to Sinai out in the wilderness, and Jesus spends 40 days out there without food, without drink, and he's being tempted. And as he's being tempted by Satan, or the Satan, I'm going to have to get used to calling him that, he begins to quote Deuteronomy, which is also part of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. He quotes that back to them. Yeah. And so where Israel failed in the wilderness, both before and after the law, Jesus has now succeeded. Yeah. And then you get to Matthew 5-7, because after that 2 months, Israel shows up at Mount Sinai, which is where they're given the 10 Commandments, but they're also given the other 613 laws of the Torah. And Jesus stands up on a mountain, Matthew 5:17. Again, this is how you know that Matthew is making this point really explicitly, that the teachings from the Sermon on the Mount show up in Luke, but Luke says that he was on flat ground. Right? He's in a totally different place when Luke talks about this. But in Matthew, he's up on a mountain. Are those stories contradictory? No, he probably preached the sermon multiple times.
Yeah.
Right. It was like, I've got some sermons that if you ask me to go around, I'm going to preach them multiple times because they're like my go-to. The Sermon on the Mount was Jesus' go-to thing.
Yeah.
So Luke chooses an instance where he's not up on a mountain.
Right.
Matthew chooses one where he is on the mountain. Why? Because Moses went up on the mountain to get the tablets and to bring them back down.
Yeah.
That's part of the story. And so then you get the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, is that new moment of the law. Then as you walk through the rest of Matthew, Jesus goes around. He's healing people. He's feeding people. He's restoring people. This is all the stuff Israel was supposed to do. As part of being a blessing to all the nations, this is what Israel was meant to spread, but they never did it.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is going around playing the role of Israel, bringing healing, bringing hope, bringing restoration to the nations, setting people free. He is, again, embodying Israel. Again, why did Jesus choose 12 disciples? Because Israel had 12 tribes. All of this is echo and echo and echo and echo of this. And so Jesus comes and he does the very thing Israel could not do, which is why I would say when we talk about like atonement theory, which I know is a word not everyone gets into, but the leading atonement theory that you get is what's called penal substitutionary atonement. And that's this whole idea that Jesus took my place on the cross. And God punished him so he wouldn't have to punish me. I get Jesus' righteousness, and he takes my punishment. And I would say, yes, if you believe that, that's fine. But I think it's better than that. I think what Jesus did on the cross is so much more multifaceted, because I do see penal substitutionary atonement in what Jesus did. But I see penal in the sense that Jesus was taking the curse of the covenant. It wasn't God just lashing out because he didn't. He's not just bloodthirsty. This is the problem with how you talk about what happened on the cross can paint God in a bad light. He wasn't bloodthirsty. He was upholding a covenant that Israel agreed to. And so it wasn't so penal in the sense that somebody was getting hit with the curse. Substitutionary because it was God and not Israel. Atonement because that's what it brought. So I'm down with PSA. I just don't like what happened. I talked about this yesterday, how the Bible's not primarily about us. We took the atonement theory and just stuck ourselves in it. We are part of it because we are the ones that will come after. Israel was meant to bless the whole world, and because Jesus fulfills the covenant, now the whole world can get in on the new covenant. Yes, in some way, Jesus was taking our place on that cross, but first and foremost, he was taking Israel's place. And that's the true penal substitution that was taking place in that moment. And once the old covenant is fully and finally exhausted between the curse and the fulfillment, now Jesus can begin to talk about this new covenant that is coming, that we can now live with the presence of God within us, which we now become the new temple, the new tabernacle. And now what Israel was unable to do was to be the people of God, to be the light to the nations. The church, through the power of the Spirit, can now be that people.
Yeah.
That's the story that the Bible is telling.
Yeah.
And so much more. Because again, I'm just pulling one thread right now. I wish someday I could show you all the threads that actually run all the way through all of this.
Yeah. Because then I would even say like the Great Commission that Jesus gives, again, points back to our initial purpose.
Yes.
But in light of what we're given, because we're told all authority in heaven has been given to me, and he passes that to us. Yep. And it's a new version of be fruitful and multiply. And it like, there's so
it's a new,
much.
It is the new be fruitful and multiply. That's why he says, go and make disciples.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing when you go and make disciples, when you reach someone with the gospel and you go, oh, that person's getting saved, what's happening is the image within them is being restored by the Spirit so they can now be the imager that they were always meant to be.
Yeah.
Will they stop sinning, and will these things that are destroying their lives go away? Yes. But it's not arbitrary things that we're not asking people, will you follow this law, follow this law? We're asking, will you let God remake you into the type of person that you were always meant to be anyways? And so I don't know if I ever got to it, but my final question was going to be, what type of people is God making? That's
Yeah.
the story that the Bible is actually telling, and that's what we're really going to dive into on Sunday.
Awesome. So do you have any like practical next step application for us to kind of round this out and end this for us? Or one final little nugget of truth that you would want to give us?
I just really hope that what you're seeing is, if you want to get as deep as we can in this, you're going to have to understand the Bible. And it's not that we're trying to check a box, right? This is what devotional life is. This is what bothers me about this whole like devotional life that people have. If it's not helping you see the Bible like this, I don't know, because this for me is far more transformational. That I understand that I was made for a very specific purpose, and if I don't follow that purpose, that's actually what's wrong. And I learned that purpose, and I learned God's ways through his word, and not just by reading the verse of the day, but like when I come to understand the type of person God's making me into, all of a sudden I don't need a list of rules and regulations to follow, but I learn to actually follow his spirit and his leading and his guidance. And that actually becomes transformative the more I understand that that's the story that's actually being told. And so I would just say, don't stop your devotionals or whatever you're doing, but just, man, if you're not diving deep in the word, you are leaving so much on the table in regards to transformation that's available to you.
Yeah.
Because I don't think the Bible in and of itself transforms you, but the Spirit of God takes the story of the Bible and applies it to your life in a way that's transformative. And so I hope we become a church that dives deep into the Word so that we are transformed by it. Not just the way we're informed by it, so we are transformed by it.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we will be back here again next week with another extra point and some more practical next steps for your faith journey. Again, make sure you share this with someone. And if you have further questions, deep dive things that you want us to cover, shoot us a message, leave a comment on this, and we will make an attempt to cover that as well. But we will get more into the law and the purposes behind it and how it should inform our lives and transform our lives next week.
Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Be sure to subscribe to the Southridge Church podcast and tune in every Wednesday for another episode of The Extra Point.